Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum. I'm Joe Chuman, and this is the second in an ongoing series of monthly interviews with noted writers. I should say a little bit about myself before I introduce our guest this afternoon. I am a leader in the Society for Ethical Culture in New York City. I also teach human rights in the graduate school at Columbia University and teach the same subject at Hunter College. My guest this afternoon is Mr. Joshua Greene. Let me tell you a little bit about Joshua. He is a renowned Holocaust scholar and very avid filmmaker. His documentaries on Holocaust history have appeared on PBS and Discovery, and he himself has appeared as an interviewee on NPR, particularly on Terry Gross's Fresh Air program, which I'm sure many of our viewers enjoy. He's also been on CNN and other news media. I'll be talking with Joshua about his new book that came out in April. It's called Unstoppable. Here it is, and it's a biography. It's a biography of a very extraordinary and successful man who was a Holocaust survivor, came to the United States penniless, and then became phenomenally successful on Wall Street, both in the banking and oil industries. And as we'll discover, those are two occupations which were not necessarily friendly to Jews. And his success was a breakthrough, not only in terms of success itself, but in the fact that he had to deal with an anti-Jewish environment. So anyway, Joshua Greene, welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum and our book interview series.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you. Okay, let me start off by asking you what intrigued you about Siggy Wilzig, who is the protagonist of the story. What was it about him and his story that caught your attention?
Well, I'd done about a dozen biographies prior to this one of Holocaust survivors and books on war crimes trials. And it's a very dark period to be writing about. And at one point, in fact, my wife found me kind of moping about the house with my chin on the ground. And she said, "You really got to find something else to write about." That was a few years ago. So I did. I wrote a biography of the late Beatle George Harrison, which was pure fun.
Right.
Very different side of the spectrum.
Right.
And I thought I had finished with the Holocaust, but then the phone rang about 8 years ago. And it was Siggy Wilzig's son, Ivan, at the other end of the line. He was very persuasive that I should be the person to write his late father's story, and he described something of his father to me. And I would not have accepted it, except that I started reading transcripts of his testimony for the Shoah Foundation. And there was something in the way this man processed the dark years of his life that allowed him to catapult himself to the top of the business world in America, having arrived here at age 21 with absolutely nothing. No money, no education, no contacts, no inroads, no formal training in business of any kind. And the idea that through sheer moxie and grit and determination, someone who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer could find the strength and the impetus to start again. That intrigued me. How did this man, who had seen so much horror and sadness, find the will not just to live again, but to love again, and to build a family and to really enjoy his life? How did that happen? So I thought that was a story worth telling.
Okay, very good. And I do want to talk as we go along to explore how his experiences at Auschwitz did inform his character, his later life, his success, and so on, as you implied. But let's start at the beginning. He was born in 1926 Hitler came to power in 1932. Okay, he was a German Jew, lived in Germany. Could you talk about his early life before the war and so forth, and before the Holocaust actually begins?
He grew up in a small town named Krojanka, old Krojanka in West Prussia, near what was known as the Polish corridor. So there was a lot of tension between the Germans and the Poles, a lot of anti-Semitism in Krojanka. He describes that as a boy, he would prefer to stay with the grown-ups because the kids were always taunting him and threatening to drown him and so on. So he grew up very quickly. At a young age, he studied how adults played cards, what their strategies were, how they conducted business. So even though just a young man, he had a lot of what he called fox-like instincts. When the family fled from the anti-Semitism to Berlin in the mid-30s, he started school there at vocational school, but then they closed all schools to Jews, and he was forced to work in a German-run munitions factory outside Berlin.
Right.
And then when he was 16, he was deported with his family and other Jews from Berlin to concentration camp Auschwitz.
Yeah. Before we get to that, I was wondering if more generally you could talk about the outlook and identity of German Jews in that period. I think you mentioned that his father, and it was not unusual, was proud of his German identity, as many Jews were. He had fought in World War I on behalf of the Germans, felt themselves, in many cases, highly assimilated to German society, which in some ways I've always seen as a double tragedy of the Holocaust. I mean, not only did you have the annihilation of the Jews, but they actually loved Germany to a great extent, and it was an act of absolutely gross betrayal. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about his family background, the German identity, the Jewish identity, how indeed they may have overlapped with each other or intermeshed.
Well, you're quite right. There was a pride in being German that superseded pride in being Jewish in many instances.
Right.
Siggy's father very proudly displayed his medal for valor in World War I on the wall of their living room.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been Wilzigs in Germany for more than 7 generations.
Mm-hmm.
And Siggy's family was quite extensive. He calculated later in life that there were 59 members.
Yes, right.
Of the family who had been murdered.
It's extraordinary, yeah.
By the Nazis. But there was a true pride in German culture. Remember, Germany was the cultural and intellectual leader of Europe in those days. This was the country, the birthplace of Nietzsche and Goethe and Wagner. How such a cultured people could have fallen so far is one of the great mysteries of history. But certainly up until the time that the noose began to tighten with Hitler's rise to power, there was a great pride in being German.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering if a little bit before he's transported to Auschwitz, and it was a 4-day transport stuffed into a cattle car and so forth, and you described that very graphically. If you can just talk about the darkening atmosphere for Jews in that period and how he perceived it as really an adolescent at that point.
You know, one of the things that I've learned over the years working in Holocaust history is to not generalize. There are individual men, women, and children, as in Siggy's case, who had their particular unique personal experiences. So I try to avoid talking about a German Jewish experience or an American Jewish experience, but rather if we look at the individuals and how they responded. In Siggy's case, it was a great tragedy, really, that he had to leave behind a world that for him was a very rich world. It was rich culturally. There was a familiarity among neighbors. The anti-Semitism was not always obvious or overt. It might have been there kind of simmering beneath the surface, but many people will talk about how there was an ability to get along with one's neighbors.
Mhm.
Something was let loose with the rise of the Nazi Party. There was a hatred, a bitterness, a fear that had always been there, but had been kept pretty much at bay. Along comes this, what historian Saul Friedlander refers to as redemptive anti-Semitism. This compulsion to turn that ability to live together around such that children would betray their own parents if they showed a penchant for aiding or abetting Jews. It was shocking in many ways how quickly it happened. Siggy tells the story that his family had neighbors, non-Jewish neighbors, and he would play with the neighbors' children, and if things seemed to be fine. And then as soon as the Germans came to power, and there was this sense of Jews as the other in a more overt form, the neighboring wife came to Siggy's mother and started borrowing money. And every week she would borrow more money and more money. And what could they do? If someone betrayed you to the police, you could lose everything. So there was no question, but they had to pay this money.
Right.
And at one point, when it was clear that they were having to leave home, this woman came to Siggy's mother and said, you know, I'll tell you what, leave the back door open when you go so that I can get your fur coat and your belongings. Why should we let the police have them? That's the kind of mood that was there when he was a child.
Yeah. Of course, sprinkled throughout this chapter of the book, I think maybe it's 1/3 of the book deals with his concentration camp experiences before he comes to the United States. You do basically sprinkle in facts about the Holocaust. And one of the things that struck me, which I think is important for people to know, is, as you note, between 1933 and the end of the war in 45, there was a network of 42,000 camps that kept Jews and others who were prisoners of the Nazis, extermination camps, transit camps, labor camps. It was an extraordinary, talking about the German genius for organization, technology, industry, manufacturing, and so forth. You had really the industry of killing factories that were established, but the extent of it was absolutely mind-boggling. 42,000 camps. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get back to Ziggy's story.
The Nazi Party ideology was diabolically brilliant. Mm-hmm. The insight into the psyche of a nation, the ability to play on that. Tragically, we've seen ourselves in the last many months how quickly an entire portion of the population can be weaponized by playing upon their fears, playing upon their ignorance, playing upon their angers, their disappointments. And that, frankly, was one of the great anxieties for myself and a lot of my colleagues, was seeing how eerily close the events of the last couple of years had begun to mirror circumstances in Europe in the late 1920s and early 1930s.
Right.
It was shocking.
Right, absolutely. Well, I should put in a word, just a footnote. I've become a fan of Timothy Snyder, who is the great Holocaust scholar at Yale. And he's one of the few scholars who's looked at the rise of Hitlerism in the 30s and then Stalinism, later on totalitarianism. And he's willing, one of the few scholars I think who's courageous enough to answer the question, can it happen here, based on his knowledge? And he's one of the few to say, yes, it can. A lot of people are too afraid, I think, even to enter into those waters. Timothy Snyder is an important figure, and I would love to be able to get him as one of our guests or our interview show, but I just wanted to raise that for our viewers. I think he's an important, very important figure in our times,
Yeah,
given
I'm very
the
pleased to
dark.
call
Yeah,
him a colleague. Tim is
yeah,
the faculty advisor at the Fortunoff Video Archive for
yeah.
Holocaust Testimonies at Yale, where I'm privileged to serve on the board of advisors.
No, I'm not surprised there's a correlation. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's marvelous. Okay, getting back to Siggy Wilzig. Yeah, I think, and this goes to the gist or the theme of his story and your character development. Very few people survived Auschwitz. He was among the survivors. And you seem to suggest that his survival, of course, was a combination of good luck, right? I mean, you would get off the transport and you either went to the left or the right. And very often, obviously it was not a matter of choice. You were sent to the gas chambers, or you had an opportunity to be worked to death in slave labor. And he survived that selection. And you say he actually survived more than a dozen such selections. And you seem to suggest that it's a combination of both luck, certainly, but also a type of intuitive sense that he had some sort of radar, some sort of internalized sense where he could determine that, in effect, when asked how old you are, it was better to lie and say you're 18 and not 16. When he was asked if he had some skills, he fabricated a response. Yes, he had skills as a tool maker or whatever when he didn't have any. He knew when faced with life or death decisions to make, choices to make in the death camp, he seemed to have an uncanny ability to intuit as to what the right answer would be to enable his survival. Now, of course, I don't think we can discount luck. It's not as if the smart guys survived and those who were without that faculty were doomed. I think that would be an unfair reading of the Holocaust, and it's, to put it mildly, its oppressive nature. But I'm wondering if you can comment, because that seems to be a centerpiece of your understanding of who Siggy Wilzig was and his capacity to use those skills later in life to become amazingly successful in the American environment, a totally more benign situation.
You raise an issue that's hotly debated in Holocaust studies these days, whether we can ascribe to victims of the camp any agency in their own fate. Mm-hmm. Survivors will themselves say that they cannot claim credit for having survived. It was either dumb luck, right, the hand of God. They'll very candidly admit their own lack of agency in their fate. And yet at the same time, we do see that, let's take Siggy as a good case in point. Here was someone who looked for opportunities to get a job indoors when he was very sick from pneumonia, or to survive a selection because he heard guards talking about how they need bricklayers. And all of a sudden he, at the ripe old age of 16, was a master bricklayer. That kind of instinct for becoming whatever was needed just to survive, I don't think we can discount that. Now, the reason it's so controversial is for every Siggy Wilzig who came up with an alter ego that helped him survive, you'll find 100 examples, 1,000 examples of people who attempted the very same device and failed, right, who were unsuccessful at saving their own life by inventing some alter ego for themselves. So you can't create a formula for survival in the camps. It's what Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer calls choiceless choice. Choiceless choice is a phrase that he invented to describe how in the camps, your life was not a succession of choices of good or bad, but bad and worse. Mm-hmm. The values that we ascribe to the world that we inhabit didn't apply inside the universe of the concentration camps. They were turned upside down so that compassion, charity, affection, which we exalt in the world we know as critically important to human character, could become the very thing that got you killed inside Auschwitz or one of the other camps.
Mm.
So it's a subject of, as I say, of great debate. I go back and forth on it myself. In my family, I'm known as the spiritual one. You know, practice yoga and read the Bhagavad Gita from India and chant mantras, have my morning meditations and so on. So I have a tendency to lean toward that direction, which says that there's a core within us of something sacred. And then, of course, the next question is, well, how do you take that vision of the universe and make it coincide with what happened in Europe 80 years ago? And, I've come up with, I guess it's kind of a cliche, which is that if you turn away from your true nature, you can fall very, very far. If we turn toward our true nature, we can soar very high. So there are as many examples of soaring high in these situations of extreme torture and pain and suffering and murder as there are examples where those things work counter to survival. So I don't proselytize about it. I have my own opinion.
Yeah, well, one of the things, I mean, we can get into this ethical discussion, which I think is critically important, but as an outsider who can not begin to imagine what the hell must have been like to be imprisoned in a concentration camp, I think it's necessary to basically, at all costs, to refrain from blaming the victim. Again, I am aware, reading Holocaust material as to how powerless people were who were, basically pulled off of transports and shoved into gas chambers through no choice of their own. And I think that, to my mind, is a supervening reality. And some may have survived because of, some qualities of character that they were able to manifest. But I think the overarching oppressive reality was out of their hands. And I've always looked at the Holocaust that way and so forth.
I think there's another side to that as well, which is, along with not blaming the victims, neither should we glamorize them. No. There's a tendency to elevate survivors as though survival in itself was some kind of an heroic gesture. It wasn't. Mm-hmm. You don't hear survivors talking about themselves as heroes. Right. You hear them talking about the unheroic, humiliating, right, embarrassing things they had to do just to survive. Right. So should we fet the human spirit? Should we celebrate that tendency toward goodness? Yes, of course we should, but we should do it with our feet on the ground. Right. There was a group here on Long Island that approached me with a project. They wanted to do a documentary about survivors who had set up their homes on Long Island. And I said, well, show me something about it. And they sent me a flyer that said, these men and women embody all that is noble in the human spirit. Mm-hmm. They are the epitome of the will to survive. I said, well, time out. The 6 million who didn't survive, they lacked human spirit. Mm-hmm. Somehow they were deprived of the will to survive. They would have to be very careful about imposing our own need for closure on the realities of history.
Okay, yeah, no, I think it's very well said. Before we move on, you had mentioned Ziggy had calculated after the war that he had lost 59 relatives in his extended family. Can you talk a little bit about the fate of his immediate family, who they were and what destiny they encountered?
Yeah. Siggy had the tragic experience arriving at Auschwitz of seeing his mother, his elder sister, her husband, and their young child all sent directly to the gas chamber. He had a brother who was sent to Buchenwald, who died there. Mm-hmm. He had no information about his father's fate for about 6-7 weeks. And then when he was pretending to be a doctor's assistant and worked in the prisoner hospital in Buna Monowitz, he found his father there, who had been beaten within an inch of his life, and he lay dying. The guards had been beating him with a rubber truncheon. And he tells this story in his testimony for the Shoah Foundation. It's a story that he never told before. He disclosed this just a few weeks before he passed away, when the Shoah Foundation was taping him at his home in Fort Lee. He said that as a assistant to the doctors, he was told by the SS to distribute a vat of grated potatoes to all of the prisoners. Now, what he did not know is that the potatoes had been poisoned. They were trying to get rid of all of the patients who were not going to make it, so that they would make room for prisoners who just needed some time to recover so they could send them back to work again. And Siggy passed out these poisoned potatoes to all of the patients, including his father. And he said to camera, he said, I think I helped kill my father.
Mm.
And he lived with that thought for all of his life.
Right. Well, it was an example of the abject horror and degradation of being in a concentration camp. There's one phenomenon in Auschwitz that you cite that I simply can't understand, and maybe you can clarify it for me. Didn't make sense to me. You mentioned that there was a warehouse at Auschwitz where the belongings of the Jews who were transported were kept, everything from jewelry to luggage and who knows what else they had. And you said that the prisoners had access to that warehouse. They could basically ransack it and use those materials to bribe the guards. Now, I didn't quite understand that, given the power inequities, to put it mildly, that prisoners confronted at Auschwitz. I would have thought that the prisoners could not be bribed by possessions that the Jews themselves had owned that was taken from them, because all the guards had to do was, with a flick of the wrist, send them to the gas chambers. So I don't quite understand the discretionary freedom that the prisoners had actually to bribe the guards. That was a new insight for me. How was that? Did you talk a little bit about that?
Let me correct what may be a misimpression. The warehouses that you're referring to were called Canada by the prisoners, because Canada was a country that they envisioned as a very wealthy, comfortable place.
Right.
So these warehouses were called Canada. These were the very large spaces where all of the suitcases and other possessions that arrived with Jews who were being who had been deported to Auschwitz. When they arrived at the unloading platform, all of their possessions were taken away, and they were sent in carts and trucks to these Canada warehouses. There were a few hundred prisoners working in those warehouses, sorting the goods. They were sorting the goods under close supervision. So let's be clear that this wasn't some kind of a supermarket where they could just walk in and collect things.
Right.
All of the gold, jewelry, medicines, watches, pocket knives, eyeglasses, any other valuables that were found in these suitcases, valises, backpacks, or whatever, were put into large trunks, sealed, and then sent by train to Army headquarters in Berlin.
I see.
Those prisoners who were fortunate enough to get a job sorting these belongings in the Canada warehouses would, at great risk, find something and squirrel it away. Siggy, for example, described that he would take empty toilet paper, the cardboard centers from toilet paper, and use it as a kind of purse. So he would put a watch or whatever he might have found as a way of securing those valuables that he would then later barter for food, or in his case, he would barter for bits of soap. He knew the importance of staying clean. You know, prisoners didn't just die in the camps from beatings and starvation and a bullet to the head. They also died from the deterioration of their own bodies.
Sure.
So staying clean was a very critical objective, and Siggy was careful to maintain cleanliness as far as possible.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just one other point. Now we really want to get into his story, but there again, this is such important material in terms of the Holocaust itself. One thing that you reinforce is something that I think is fairly well known, but you made clear, and that is that there were American bombers that were in the vicinity of Auschwitz. They were just maybe a few miles away, and it wouldn't have taken much to fly basically off course a little bit and bomb Auschwitz to smithereens, which would have ended up saving untold lives. And yet American policy reneged on that opportunity. And I was wondering if, again, just from a historical point of view, can talk a little bit about that, the American reluctance to intervene in what would have been a humanitarian gesture of relatively little cost.
Yeah, Siggy spoke about this. He lectured constantly. After coming to America and establishing, you might say, a power base for himself of wealth and influence, he used that platform to teach Holocaust history. One of the points that he insisted on time and time again was this absolutely shameful decline on the part of the US government to unload. They had a payload of extra bombs that were left over from their bombing runs to destroy German factories. It would have been not only easy, but economical and expedient for the bombers to have unloaded the remainder of their bombs on the train tracks, for example, leading into the concentration camps. They didn't do that. And if you read the transcripts of some of the subcommittee hearings that took place after the war, you'll read, for example, the testimony of John J. McCloy, who was deputed by Roosevelt as the person responsible for rebuilding Germany after the war, that we couldn't afford to detour away from our main objective, which was winning the war. Now, that's patently false. And when they were building the Washington Holocaust Museum, there was a very intense discussion about whether or not this point, that is to say, the reluctance of the US government to do something about these trains bringing prisoners to their death in the camps, should perhaps be displayed on the walls of the museum. If you go to the Washington Museum today, you will see these aerial photographs of the camps. You will see the targets that were not bombed by the US and British planes. And Siggy's insistence to the very end was, this was blatant anti-Semitism. This had nothing to do with the expediency of war or one objective over another. It would have been very simple, very easy for those bombs to have been dropped on the train tracks. And they refused to do it. And he's convinced that there was a certain degree of anti-Semitism at work there.
Yeah. Okay, as the Red Army was approaching, the Nazis attempted very futilely to cover their tracks and basically took the survivors from Auschwitz, and you said there were 6,000 of them that were engaged in a forced march to Mauthausen, which was another camp in Austria, and something like only 1,600 survived, and Ziggy was among them. Can you begin to tell us a little bit about his activity, adventures, and so forth after he served a short while in the Austrian concentration camp, Mauthausen, and then was liberated and had some experiences in Europe before he came over to the United States?
There's what I find to be one of the most engaging stories about Siggy in the book toward the end of the war. It was in January of 1945 when, as you described, Stalin's forces were heading west and liberating the camps. At that point, the German army made the decision to hide whatever evidence they could of their crimes inside the camps by marching whatever remaining prisoners were still alive to camps farther inside Germany and Austria. In January, I think 16th, it might have been, Siggy and those other thousands of prisoners were sent on a death march from Auschwitz to Mauthausen. It took several days, in freezing cold weather. And at one point, when the guards weren't looking, they had bedded the prisoners down in the snow for the night. Siggy looked around and wondered what he could do because he had a problem. The problem was that his shoes were falling off. The laces had deteriorated in the slush and the snow and the cold. And these wooden shoes, if they weren't secured against your feet, one little splinter in your foot could kill you. Because if you were a prisoner in Auschwitz, your body had no resources to fight infection. So he had to figure out what to do. He looked and he saw a birch tree, kind of a small sapling of a tree, and he went over and with the edge of a spoon, which is the only thing he took with him out of Auschwitz, he scarred bits of bark from the tree. He rubbed them in his hands to warm them up, and he braided them together, wrapped them around his feet. And sure enough, they held. His life literally was saved by bits of tree bark fashioned into shoelaces. And he said to an interviewer years later, only the Almighty could have put an idea like that in your head for how to survive.
Right.
Those are the kind of opportunities that he looked for. And he applied those same kind of intuitive skills later in business.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Now, you said when he went on the march out of Auschwitz, he weighed barely 80 pounds at that point, right? I mean, he had shriveled down he was skeletal, effectively, no?
Yeah. I mean, prisoners
right.
inside Auschwitz were fed something on the order of 700 calories a day. Now, that's starvation level.
Right.
If you try to survive on 700 calories a day, particularly given the kind of slave labor they were forced to perform, you're not going to last very long. And so they were walking skeletons. I mean, when the American troops arrived at Mauthausen, and when the Russians arrived in Auschwitz, they couldn't believe their eyes.
Yeah, I know. They're pictures of General Eisenhower touring one of the camps with his troops, and they were flabbergasted. I mean, these battle-hardened soldiers had never seen anything like it. It was extraordinary. Okay, let's move on. He comes to the United States, makes his way over to the US, the other side of the Atlantic. He's penniless. Talk to us about his first few years and the type of menial labor that he was involved in and working himself up in a sort of mercantile, from being shoveling snow in the Bronx to basically mercantile activities that led him into the world of business.
Well, would you mind if I just read a couple of paragraphs from the first
Sure,
chapter
go ahead.
of the book?
Well, please go ahead.
Kind of
Sure, absolutely.
sets the scene here.
Right.
Ziggy looked out from his window. He's in the Marseille Hotel in Harlem, which had been converted into a refugee center for immigrants arriving from war-torn Europe. Amazement over being in America was quickly giving place to harsh realities. What now, he wondered? He had no money, no resources, no credentials. He spoke with a thick German accent, stood 5 feet, 5.5 inches short. Years of starvation and torture were still in his mind, yet here he was, breathing, staring out the window at snow-covered New York. By comparison with the past, everything here was a paradise. The bus ride to Harlem from Ellis Island had been paradise. His smelly room in an overcrowded hotel with cockroaches scurrying across scuffed hardwood floors, the heavy snowfall outside his window, the few dollars in his pocket which would soon disappear if he didn't find work. It was all paradise. On the street below his window, weary pedestrians fought driving winds, evoking for Sigbert, his name was Siggy originally, harsh memories of other blinding storms when starving men and women trudged forward on death marches wearing nothing more than prisoner uniforms. He saw that New Yorkers who had never set foot inside a concentration camp were alive in every sense. He liked that. He would do that too, grasp opportunities and not allow the darkness of the past to rob him of a bright future. In that seminal moment of his new life, he made 3 promises to himself. First, he would never go hungry again. Second, he would marry a Jewish woman, have children, and help rebuild the Jewish people. Third, he would preserve Holocaust memory and speak up whenever he witnessed injustice. He had no illusions about these vows. He knew better than to think he could change the world. Anti-Semitism would never go away. That was just business as usual. Still, the Almighty had saved him, and now his job was to grab whatever scraps remained from the rubbles of his life and cobble them back together into an edifice yet to be determined size and shape.
Okay, very well said.
So
Okay.
here you have this young man alive somehow by the will of the Almighty. And he sees himself in America where everything is miraculous to him. There's food, food in abundance, spilling over on carts, food carts. And he makes these vows at 21 years of age. By the time he was done, he passed away in 2003. He left behind him a business empire with more than $4 billion in assets.
Well, let's talk about how he got there. Okay. Yeah, he enters into both the oil and the banking industry. And a point that you make, despite anti-Semitic tropes, Jews are not bankers controlling the world. In fact, banking has been one profession in which Jews have been underrepresented. I mean, there were exceptions. I think in the 19th century, Joseph Seligman, for example, was the head of a Jew, had a very large banking family. There have been exceptions, but generally Jews have been excluded from banking, and you don't think of Jews as oilmen, okay, interested in digging Texas oil wells. Can you talk a little bit about those industries, how they were unfriendly to Jews, and why in the world this German Jew and survivor of Auschwitz with no education, no money, and so on and so forth, aspires to become an oilman and a banker?
Yeah, it is one of the great myths of history that somehow Jews control everything. It also bears mentioning that Siggy's first jobs when he came to America at age 21 were shoveling snow,
Yeah, right.
and cleaning toilets in sweatshops in the Lower East Side.
Right.
So humble origins, if ever there were. He graduated to selling neckties.
Mm-hmm.
And with the few dollars in commissions that he earned selling neckties, he taught himself to buy stocks. He would read the papers and intuit which might be a good deal. And he discovered this one kind of sleepy oil company in Texas called Wilshire and started buying stock. At a gathering in New Jersey, he meets a man who was a much more sophisticated investor than he was. But Saul Diamond was also much older. He was approaching 80. Knew that this Wilshire oil company was ripe for a takeover, but he didn't have the energy to do it himself. He saw in this young man, this young refugee, the energy, the moxie, the drive to maybe do it. So he offered him that opportunity. He said, I'll help you, I'll guide you here. But the first thing you got to do is acquire enough stock to take over the company. So Ziggy developed what one of the 100 people I interviewed for this book described as a Shakespearean oratory ability. He would convince everybody, neighbors, friends, the few remaining family members that he had, to come in with him and buy stocks. They pool their stocks, and sure enough, they become a bit of a threat to the board of directors of this oil company. Eventually, they give him a shot. This old school waspy board say, okay, you little Jewish so-and-so, let's see what you can do. And sure enough, he comes in and figures out where to economize, where to let certain people go, where to optimize the opportunities they have before them. There was something that we now know is fracking, which was just making its way into the oil and gas industry. Wilshire had properties that were undeveloped. Ziggy figured out a way to develop all of these opportunities, and Wilshire, within the short span of a few years, quadrupled its revenues. The board elected him first as president, then their CEO, and then chairman of the board. He needed more money to grow his oil company. His lawyer advised him, well, why don't you get a bank? Banks have lots of money. So he went back to the papers and found another similar situation in a bank in New Jersey called Trust Company. Same thing, an old school board of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant directors started going directly to the shareholders, telling them, listen, I want you to know something. I have faced the worst that history has to offer, and I'm still here. You won't find someone more motivated than me to grow this bank to your benefit and to mine and my shareholders. So they gave him a shot. Same thing happened. He figured out somehow, without any formal training, not one day in business school, imagine all the things you have to know to run a bank, right? About interest rates and stocks and bonds and convertibles and I mean, you name it. He figured out what to do, grew the two banks, the bank and oil company, to a point where they were able to file a consolidated tax return. At that point, he qualified for what was known as upstreaming. Now, this is interesting. We're detouring just a little bit, but I want you to understand how sharp this man's intuitions were. Upstreaming was a concession offered by the government to companies like oil and gas, where there was a long delay between the investment of money and when you could actually harvest some profits from the resources you were taking out of the ground. If an oil and gas company like Wilshire owned a bank, that is to say, they were the parent company of a bank, the bank had the legal right to take whatever monies was taxable on their earnings. Instead of sending it to Uncle Sam, they could write a check to their parent company, Wilshire Oil. That's what happened. And he had this, he called it his cash cow. The bank was sending money to Wilshire. He's growing his companies. And at that point, unfortunately, there was runaway inflation in the country. And the Federal Reserve obliged him, forced him to divest. They said, you have until midnight of such and such a date, 1980, I believe, in February, to either get rid of your banks or get rid of your commercial oil and gas business. Ziggy was the first person in history to sue the Federal Reserve. He said, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm making money with all of my businesses. Why should I shut any of them down? Forbes magazine did a profile on Ziggy, and they ended their profile by saying, what's the Fed when you've stared down the Gestapo?
Right.
That's the kind of character we're dealing with here.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting. And, obviously he was intuitively extremely bright, without any formal education, to be able to master the complexities of American business and be extraordinarily successful. There seems to be an element from what you're saying, though, given his lack of education, given his lack of Americanization, his experience, there seems to be an element of chutzpah in this man. In other words, he has a sense of his own narcissistic capacities that may have in some ways exceeded some of the empirical resources that this guy had. And I'm saying was able to fly on his own self-importance in some ways. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit.
Well, you're putting your finger on a very sensitive issue here. There were many who came out of the Holocaust and did very well. Why not? They had faced death, torture, starvation, and they were still alive. They had nothing to lose. There's nothing that anyone can do to intimidate them in business. So a lot of people coming out of those tragic years did well for themselves. No one did what Ziggy did, which is to take over an oil and gas company and a commercial bank and build them to the level of $4 billion in assets. But the point is that you're quite correct. There was something that went past the normal, what we might say, the normal limits of human behavior. There was something extraordinary going on there. And people have attempted to define it. Sometimes they call it survivor syndrome. Sometimes they call it PTSD. You can label these things, but I don't think you can understand them just by labeling. There was something going on in Ziggy that defies labeling. It was a sense of historic importance that he was obligated by the mere fact of being alive to make something of himself, to do something that would help rebuild the Jewish people. He was an avid supporter of the state of Israel, which, as far as he was concerned, was the greatest miracle of all time. And yes, he was damaged by his experiences. His children were quite candid, talking about how the worst thing they could do to hurt their father was date outside the Jewish faith. Siggy would tell them, if you do that, I might as well have died in Auschwitz. Because it means Hitler won. It's just another way of killing off the Jewish people.
Yeah, I want to talk about
adamant.
Okay, I want to talk about some of his personal life and some of his limitations. And I think maybe everybody is a mix of obviously virtues and vulnerabilities and limitations. And I do want to talk about his personality in a realistic and balanced way. But before I do that, I want to talk about, as you do in the book, his support of Holocaust preservation, his role in the Holocaust Museum, his friendship with Elie Wiesel. And then I want you to talk a little bit about his fracture with Ronald Reagan over the Bitburg controversy, because that you talk a great deal about that. And I think that for our viewers who are not familiar with it, they should be, because that was, for those of us who are not fans of Ronald Reagan, that was another basically nail in his coffin. So if you can, excuse me for the bad metaphor, but if you can talk a little bit about his commitment to Holocaust preservation, his upset at Holocaust denial, role in the museum, Elie Wiesel, and so forth, that aspect of his life.
We can attempt to define the Holocaust from many different perspectives. This is, as a sidebar, one of the least represented perspectives is that of the ultra-Orthodox. The deeply believing Jews have a very, very different interpretation of the Holocaust than, let's say, the Zionist perspective does. One of the perspectives would be to say, this is what happened to our people when we did not have our own state, when we did not have our own army, when we were unable to defend ourselves. And for Siggy in particular, who had educated himself so deeply about what could have been done by the world, because there was information about what was going on that had leaked out to European and American government authorities. For someone like Siggy, the imperative of preserving Holocaust memory, of making sure the world understood what happened, was the very atomic core of his life. If he were here today, and if you were going to ask him, what is your message to the world? More than likely it would be, teach the Holocaust. Never forget the Holocaust. Make sure that young people in particular understand what happened, why. Dive into the details and don't allow yourself to be placated just with superficialities. The Holocaust, Professor Lawrence Langer describes as being reduced in education today to a name, a place, and a number. The name is Mengele, the place is Auschwitz, and the number is 6 million. And that's more or less all that anybody knows. Few people understand, for example, that more people were killed in the path to the Soviet Union in the Eastern Front than were killed inside the camps. You'll learn about this in Timothy Schneider's book, Bloodlands. You'll also learn about this if you look at the work of Father Patrick Desbois, who has uncovered, I think, something on the order of 1,200 mass graves that were previously unincorporated in our calculation of numbers killed. So for Siggy, the study of the details of the Holocaust was absolutely critical. He very sarcastically would say, we know so little about history. If you ask somebody, what do you know about Napoleon? He'd say, oh yeah, I had one for dessert last night. People know nothing about history, certainly nothing about the actual details of the Holocaust. So for him, being invited by fellow Auschwitz survivor Elie Wiesel to help with the establishment of the Washington Museum was an absolutely precious opportunity. He stepped in He reformed their business practices. He increased the degree of the interview process. So knowing who was being allowed in to this opportunity to build this important museum. There were critically vital issues that he was instrumental in helping resolve. For example, should the museum, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, limit itself to the Jewish Holocaust? Or should victims of other genocides, such as the Armenian genocide, be also represented in this museum? After all, the Jews were not the only people targeted by the Nazis. Ziggy made the point, along with other members of the Museum Council, that yes, others were targeted for dehumanization and for imprisonment and torture. Only the Jewish people were targeted for absolute and complete elimination, thorough extermination. And for him, broadening the emphasis of the Washington Museum to include other such examples of man's inhumanity to man was watering down the specificity of the Holocaust. And as far as he was concerned, that was a travesty that must not be allowed to happen.
Okay.
He had that same kind of, you mentioned Bitburg, if you'd like, I'll tell you a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes.
Well, Reagan made the tragic mistake, which many commentators on his presidency say was the most fatal flaw in his presidency, of agreeing to Helmut Kohl's proposal that he join Prime Minister Kohl in visiting the Bitburg Cemetery as a way of celebrating the partnership between these two countries. What President Reagan claims to not have understood was that Bitburg was the cemetery where a number of SS officers had also been buried. Now, the idea of an American president honoring the people who killed his family, the people who were responsible for the horrors and atrocities of the concentration camps and the mobile killing vans, the Einsatzgruppen, was beyond imagining. And he went on the airwaves. He spoke up every way he possibly could. You may recall the popular radio commentator Barry Farber.
Yes.
Siggy was a frequent guest on Barry Farber's show. And he spoke out. The last time he was on Farber's show was just before the Bitburg visit by Reagan. Unfortunately, Reagan did not change his mind. And he did visit that cemetery. And it was one of the great, I think, the great debacles as far as Siggy was concerned of American history.
Right. Well, he wasn't the only one to feel that way. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit. I want to veer a little bit into a more complete picture of his personality. You know, forgive me if I veer towards the negative, but I think it really is hinted at in your book in some ways, in the way in which you draw his personality. First of all, you do talk about his marriage to Naomi, which they had to elope, and then she fades very quickly from the picture, which led me to be a little bit suspicious. And then towards the end, you indicate that their marriage had all but fallen apart. They lived separately, and there didn't seem to be a great deal of love in that regard. His relationships with his children, whom he clearly loved very dearly, was in some ways fraught. Not always harmonious, didn't approve of his son Ivan wanting to become a musician rather than a successful businessman in his own image. He also, and I'll be honest about this, you paint a personality who is not altogether pleasant. Sure enough, he was good to his clientele in the banks and so on, and he greeted everybody and treated everybody with at least formal respect. And I'm a little bit suspicious as to whether this was really a quality of his character or whether it was really a strategy by which to win clientele for his banks. It's not particularly clear in the book, right, as to what the motivation was. But he was not a particularly nice man, from what you paint. He was a Schreier, yelling and screaming at people. He referred to others as schmucks, and so on and so forth. This is not an altogether pleasant personality. Also, I've got to say this, and this is maybe a function of his limitation. Again, he was without education, and beyond the Holocaust and basically the preservation of the Jewish people, he did not seem to have a broad range of interests. We don't know what his politics was. You don't mention whether he was a Democrat, even a Democrat or a Republican. He had the opportunity to become educated in this country. I see no commitment to the liberal arts or broadening his mind beyond his areas of expertise in banking and business and oil and electronics. This was a man, I would think in some ways, was rather narrow and in some sense really constricted by, and I'm not blaming him, everybody is a product of their circumstance, but he didn't seem to take very much interest in broadening his own intellectual life. I don't know if he had supported any causes. I don't know whether he supported the war in Vietnam or was opposed to it. I get a sense he may have veered on the conservative side, but I don't know. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this man in the broader and indeed negative aspects of his character. And we have to say, Joshua, we all have our negative qualities. So I'm just trying to get a portrait of who Ziggy was. Yeah.
No, you're perfectly within your rights to ask these questions. And I'm within my rights to obfuscate. We
don't want you to obfuscate. We want transparency, right?
I'm going to give you a straightforward answer. I'm going to preface my answer there by saying that it is the burden of a biographer such as myself,
right,
to have to portray a lifetime in 300 pages. And that's just not fair. It's not possible to condense a human being into, 80,000 words. It can't be done. You can give a general direction. You can give an impression. You can't give a full portrait. So you have to make certain decisions. There are 1,000 books about Abraham Lincoln. Every one of them has a different perspective.
Right.
So, from the outset, it was agreed upon between myself and the family that this was not going to be a tell-all. We weren't trying to write the National Enquirer here. We were trying to tell an important story about someone who achieved extraordinary things in his lifetime. Was he damaged by what he'd gone through? Of course he was. I don't think you will find someone who came out of the Holocaust who was not damaged in some way, shape, or form. Right. So keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind that I've lived with Siggy now, and I mean lived with him for the last 8 years. And you don't live with someone that long without developing some real affection for them, mm-hmm. and a deep understanding of what makes them tick. I will tell you as honestly as I can, and I consider myself an honest person, that Siggy might have been a difficult personality. He was not a cruel man. There were times when he was strident. There were times when he was unreasonable. There are times when his yelling absolutely grated people the wrong way. But if you were able to get past the initial shock of his behavior and you breathed into it, this is where practicing yoga really helps. Go into your yogic breathing and go deeper inside what's going on in that moment. And what you will find is that he's trying to get across something for your benefit. He's trying to get something through to you that his arsenal of tools allows him to do only by yelling and screaming. This is his way of impressing upon you that, schmuck, don't you understand that what you're doing is dangerous? Don't you understand whether what you're doing is foolish? you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to hurt others, you're going to lose money, you're going to be bad for my bank, you're going to be bad for my customers, and I'm not going to let you do this. I'm citing people whom I interviewed who worked with him for years in the bank. If you understood that the yelling and screaming was meant for your benefit, you would do quite well. People who put up with that, who took it in the right way, they earned money, and they moved forward and did well in their lives and in their investments. So there's that side of it. Now, I'm not going to make excuses. I'm not an apologist for bad behavior. There were times when, frankly, I did feel that Ziggy was unbearable. He was unstoppable, and sometimes he was unbearable. And I think I'm saying something that his own children would second on occasion for them as well. It's very difficult being the child of a Holocaust survivor, whether it's Siggy Wilzig or someone else. You carry a burden of your parents' suffering that someone who is not the child of a Holocaust survivor could not possibly understand.
Right. Okay. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this very engaging and intriguing, interesting interview to an end. I just have one final question, and maybe Andrew can tell us if there are any people who are viewing who have any questions they've put on the chat. We want to give some time for that. I just want to ask you the very basic question. In what way, having lived with him for 8 years, in what way is his life positively exemplary? I mean, what do we take away from this man that we might be able to use in terms of enriching our own lives?
A heart of gold.
Oh.
A wicked sense of humor. A desire to do good for others. An absolute respect for the dignity of life and the equality of all people, whatever their background may be. Mm-hmm. This man, he might have been strict, even to the point of being stringent, but he was not a bigot. This was someone who offered respect to everyone, whether it was an executive in one of his companies, or a teller, or the man sweeping the floor after hours. Mm-hmm. He offered utmost respect to every human being.
But you do make that very clear, right? Yeah.
He was also someone, I think, who understood the importance of getting a good education. He understood the importance of understanding history. He was someone who did such immense good for the Jewish people. My goodness, it's hard to calculate how much good he did. There are qualities in this man that are hard to bear, and there are qualities that I, for myself, would hope to emulate in my own life.
Isn't that lovely? Well, Joshua, thank you so very much. I guess we need to bring our interview to an end. Let me just say what a joy it's been getting to meet you and talking to you about Unstoppable. It's really been a great afternoon. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure.
Okay, good luck. Good luck with the book. Right. Bye-bye now.